Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she adjusted the heavy tool belt around her waist. The construction site buzzed with activity around her, but she felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. Being the only woman on a crew of 30 men meant she was always under scrutiny, always having to prove herself twice as hard as anyone else. "Hey, Martinez," called out Jake Thompson, the site supervisor, his voice cutting through the noise of machinery. "We need someone to check the electrical connections on the 3rd floor. Think you can handle it without electrocuting yourself?" The comment drew snickers from several nearby workers. Sarah had heard variations of this joke every day for the past 3 weeks since joining the crew. She simply nodded and gathered her equipment, refusing to give them the reaction they were looking for. As she climbed the scaffolding to the 3rd floor, she could hear Jake's voice carrying up from below. "I still don't know why they hired her," he was saying to his buddy Mike. "This is man's work. She's gonna get someone hurt, mark my words." Sarah had heard it all before. In her 2 months at Morrison Construction Company, she had faced constant doubt about her abilities. The men questioned everything she did, from her knowledge of electrical systems to her ability to lift heavy materials. They made jokes about her size, her gender, and her competence. What they didn't know was that their newest team member had a background that would shock them all. At 28 years old, Sarah looked like any other construction worker in her hard hat and safety vest. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with a lean but strong build, her dark hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her hands showed calluses from both construction work and something else entirely, something her co-workers couldn't identify but would often comment on. "Those aren't normal work hands," Mike had mentioned to Jake just the week before. "They're too. I don't know, different somehow." What Mike couldn't know was that those calluses came from 12 years of military service, including 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Sarah had served as a combat engineer with the 82nd Airborne Division, specializing in explosive ordnance disposal and forward operating base construction under enemy fire. The hands that her co-workers mocked had defused improvised explosive devices, operated heavy machinery under combat conditions, and saved countless lives. But Sarah kept this information to herself. When she had left the military 6 months earlier, she had made a conscious decision to start fresh in civilian life. She wanted to be judged on her current abilities, not her past service. She hoped that her skills would speak for themselves without having to rely on her military credentials for respect. The decision to keep quiet about her background became harder each day as the harassment intensified. Jake Thompson, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in undermining her confidence in front of the crew. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s who had worked construction for over 20 years. He prided himself on running a tight ship and often boasted about his ability to spot who would make it in the industry and who wouldn't. "I've seen 1,000 people come through these sites," Jake would tell anyone who would listen. "I can tell within a week who's got what it takes. That girl doesn't belong here." His daily routine of assigning Sarah the most difficult or dangerous tasks wasn't coincidental. He genuinely believed that if he made things hard enough, she would quit and save everyone the trouble of dealing with what he saw as an inevitable accident waiting to happen. On this particular Tuesday morning, as Sarah carefully examined the electrical connections on the 3rd floor, she could hear Jake's voice growing louder below. He was telling a story about a woman who had worked on one of his previous sites and had supposedly caused a major accident by not following safety procedures. "That's why I don't trust them with the important stuff," Jake concluded. "They just don't have the mental toughness for this kind of work. They panic under pressure." Sarah continued her work, methodically checking each connection with the thoroughness that had kept her alive during night raids in Kandahar. Her trained eye quickly identified several connections that had been improperly installed, creating serious fire hazards. As she began making the necessary corrections, she reflected on the irony of Jake's comments about mental toughness and pressure. She remembered her 3rd deployment, when her unit had come under heavy mortar fire while she was defusing an IED outside a school in Ramadi. With explosions landing closer by the minute and her teammates providing covering fire, she had maintained the steady hands and clear mind necessary to disarm a device that could have leveled the entire building full of children. The memory made Jake's concerns about her ability to handle construction stress almost laughable. The morning passed slowly as Sarah completed her electrical work with precision that would have impressed her supervisors if they had bothered to check. Instead, Jake assigned her next task without even looking at her completed work: cleaning and organizing the tool storage area, a job typically given to the newest and least trusted workers. As she worked in the storage area, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her pause. Two of the younger workers, Tony and Marcus, were discussing Jake's treatment of her. "I don't know, man," Tony was saying. "She seems to know what she's doing. Yesterday I saw her wire the junction box faster and cleaner than Rodriguez, and he's been doing electrical for 15 years. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, and did you see how she handled that crane operation last week? She positioned that beam perfectly on the first try. Jake had to redo it 3 times when he tried the same thing the day before." "But Jake keeps saying she's dangerous," Tony replied, uncertainty clear in his voice. "Maybe Jake's just, old school," Marcus suggested diplomatically. Sarah appreciated that at least some of her co-workers were beginning to notice her competence, but she knew that as long as Jake remained convinced of her inadequacy, her position on the crew would remain precarious. She had seen this dynamic before in the military when new commanding officers would dismiss experienced soldiers based on preconceived notions rather than performance. The lunch break arrived with its usual social dynamics. The crew gathered around several picnic tables set up near the construction trailers, forming their typical groups based on experience levels and friendships. Sarah usually ate alone, partly by choice and partly because few of the men made any effort to include her in their conversations. Today, however, Jake seemed particularly animated as he held court at the center table, regaling his audience with stories of various workplace accidents he had witnessed over the years. His voice carried clearly across the lunch area as he described each incident in dramatic detail, always emphasizing how proper experience and judgment could have prevented the accidents. "The problem with hiring people who don't belong," Jake declared, glancing meaningfully in Sarah's direction, "is that they don't understand the real dangers. They think they can just learn as they go, but this job doesn't give you second chances." Mike nodded enthusiastically. "Remember that kid from Boston a few years back? Thought he knew everything because he had some fancy technical training. Nearly brought down that whole scaffold system because he didn't understand basic physics." "Exactly my point," Jake continued, his voice growing louder. "Some people just don't have the background for this kind of work. They come in here with no real experience, no understanding of how things work under pressure, and they expect us to trust them with equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars." Sarah continued eating her sandwich, her expression neutral despite the obvious references to her. She had learned long ago that responding to such provocation usually only made situations worse. Instead, she focused on finishing her lunch quickly so she could return to work and avoid further commentary. However, Jake wasn't finished. Standing up from his table, he walked over to where Sarah sat alone and addressed her directly for the first time that day. "Martinez," he said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "After lunch, I need you to help Rodriguez with the rebar placement on the foundation. Try not to slow him down too much." Sarah nodded calmly. "No problem." Jake studied her face, apparently looking for signs of intimidation or frustration. Finding neither, he continued. "And make sure you follow his lead exactly. This isn't the kind of work where you can improvise or try to show off. One mistake and someone could get seriously hurt." "Understood," Sarah replied simply. The exchange had drawn the attention of the entire lunch area. Most of the crew watched silently as Jake delivered what amounted to a public lecture about following orders and knowing one's limitations. Sarah could feel the mixture of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment from some of her co-workers, but she maintained her composure throughout the interaction. After Jake returned to his table, the lunch area remained unusually quiet. Several men resumed their conversations in lower tones, but the earlier jovial atmosphere had been dampened by the uncomfortable display they had just witnessed. Tony leaned over to Marcus and whispered, "That was pretty harsh, even for Jake." Marcus glanced toward Sarah, who was now cleaning up her lunch area with the same methodical efficiency she brought to all her tasks. "She's handling it better than I would," he admitted quietly. As the lunch break ended and the crew prepared to return to work, Sarah gathered her equipment with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the morning's challenges. She had faced far more serious adversity than workplace harassment, and she knew that her skills would eventually speak for themselves. What she didn't anticipate was that the afternoon would bring a situation that would test those skills in ways her coworkers could never have imagined. As she followed Rodriguez toward the foundation work area, she noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. The foundation work required precise placement of steel reinforcement bars in a complex pattern that would support a 3-story office building. Rodriguez, an experienced worker with over a decade in construction, had been assigned to oversee the task with Sarah as his assistant. He was one of the few workers who treated Sarah with basic professional respect, though he rarely engaged in extended conversation. "We need to get this pattern exactly right," Rodriguez explained as they surveyed the work area. "The engineering specs are very specific about spacing and alignment. Any mistakes here will cause problems for the entire building." Sarah studied the blueprints carefully, her military training in reading technical diagrams serving her well. The pattern was complex but logical, requiring careful measurement and precise positioning of each piece of rebar. She could see several potential efficiency improvements in the planned approach, but she kept her observations to herself, remembering Jake's directive to follow Rodriguez's lead exactly. As they began working, Sarah's competence became increasingly apparent to Rodriguez. Her measurements were accurate, her cuts were clean, and her understanding of the structural requirements was clearly more advanced than Jake had suggested. Rodriguez found himself relying on Sarah's input more and more as the afternoon progressed. "You've done this kind of work before," Rodriguez observed during a brief break. It was a statement rather than a question. "Some," Sarah replied noncommittally. "Where did you learn structural engineering?" Rodriguez pressed gently. Sarah hesitated for a moment. "Previous job," she said simply. Rodriguez sensed that there was more to the story, but he respected her privacy. In the construction industry, many workers had backgrounds they preferred not to discuss in detail. What mattered to him was competence and reliability, both of which Sarah had demonstrated consistently. As the afternoon wore on, their work progressed ahead of schedule despite Jake's prediction that Sarah would slow Rodriguez down. The rebar placement was not only fast but exceptionally precise, meeting tolerances that exceeded the engineering specifications. Other crew members working nearby began to notice the quality of their work. "Hey Rodriguez," called out Tommy from the adjacent work area. "How are you getting those alignments so perfect? Mine keep coming out a few degrees off." Rodriguez glanced at Sarah before responding. "Just taking our time and measuring carefully," he said diplomatically. What Rodriguez didn't mention was that Sarah had quietly suggested several measurement techniques that eliminated the cumulative errors that typically plagued large-scale rebar placement. Her suggestions were subtle and respectful, presented as questions rather than corrections, but they had significantly improved their accuracy and speed. As closing time approached, Jake made his rounds to inspect the day's work. He approached the foundation area with his usual critical eye, expecting to find problems with Sarah's contribution to the project. Instead, he found rebar placement that was not only correct but superior to anything he had seen in recent memory. Jake studied the work carefully, using his own measuring tools to check spacing and alignment. He found no errors. In fact, the quality exceeded what he typically expected from his most experienced crews. He looked at Rodriguez with surprise. "This is excellent work, Rodriguez. Best I've seen in months." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "Thank you, sir." Jake continued his inspection, clearly puzzled by the exceptional quality. He knew Rodriguez was a competent worker, but this level of precision was unusual even for him. As Jake examined the work more closely, he began to notice subtle improvements in technique that he couldn't quite identify but that clearly contributed to the superior results. "Did you change your approach today?" Jake asked Rodriguez. Rodriguez glanced at Sarah again. "We just worked as a team," he said carefully. Jake followed Rodriguez's glance toward Sarah, who was quietly cleaning and organizing tools at the end of the workday. For the first time since her arrival, Jake found himself questioning his assessment of her abilities. The evidence before him suggested competence that contradicted his assumptions, but his pride prevented him from acknowledging this possibility directly. "Well," Jake said finally, "keep up the good work. We need this quality on the rest of the foundation." As Jake walked away, Rodriguez turned to Sarah with newfound respect. "I don't know what your background is," he said quietly, "but you know a lot more about construction than you let on." Sarah finished organizing the tools before responding. "I've had some training," she said simply. "Military?" Rodriguez asked perceptively. Sarah looked at him for a long moment before nodding slightly. It was the first time she had acknowledged her background to anyone at the site. Rodriguez smiled. "I thought so. My brother served in Iraq. He has the same way of doing things, precise, efficient, no wasted motion." He paused thoughtfully. "Why don't you tell Jake? It might change his attitude." Sarah shook her head. "I want to be judged on my current work, not my past service." Rodriguez respected her decision, but he could see the challenges she was creating for herself. In the construction industry, credentials and experience mattered enormously for establishing credibility and respect. By keeping her military background secret, Sarah was making her professional life much more difficult than it needed to be. As the crew prepared to leave for the day, Sarah reflected on the afternoon's events. Rodriguez's acceptance of her skills felt good, but she knew that one ally wouldn't be enough to change the overall dynamic on the site. Jake's continued skepticism, despite the evidence of her competence, suggested that her gender remained a more significant factor in his judgment than her actual abilities. The drive home gave Sarah time to think about her situation. She had left the military hoping for a fresh start, a chance to prove herself in civilian life without the weight of her combat experience defining her. But she was beginning to realize that her desire for anonymity might be counterproductive in an industry where respect was closely tied to demonstrated experience and credentials. That evening, as Sarah sat in her small apartment reviewing technical manuals to stay sharp on construction standards, she made a decision that would change everything. She would continue to let her work speak for itself, but she would also be prepared to reveal her background if circumstances required it. She had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, those circumstances would arise in a dramatic and dangerous situation that would test every skill she had learned in 12 years of military service. The storm clouds that had gathered during the afternoon were about to produce more than just rain. The emergency alarm pierced through the construction site at exactly 2:47 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon. Sarah looked up from her work installing conduit on the second floor as the sharp, repeated blasts echoed across the site. Around her, workers stopped what they were doing and looked toward the source of the alarm, the crane operation area on the far side of the construction zone. "Emergency shutdown. Emergency shutdown." Jake's voice crackled over the radio system, his usual commanding tone replaced by obvious stress and urgency. "All personnel clear the crane area immediately. We have a situation." Sarah could see workers running from the direction of the large tower crane that had been operating near the building's foundation. The crane operator's booth was visible high above, but the massive machine had stopped moving entirely. Something was seriously wrong. Without waiting for further instructions, Sarah secured her tools and headed toward the emergency area. Her military training had taught her that in crisis situations, qualified personnel moved toward the problem rather than away from it. As she approached the crane area, she could see a crowd of workers gathering at a safe distance, their faces showing confusion and concern. Jake was standing near the crane's base, his radio pressed to his ear and his expression grim. Mike stood beside him, gesturing frantically toward the crane's tower. As Sarah got closer, she could hear fragments of their urgent conversation. "Won't respond to radio calls," Jake was saying to someone on the radio, probably the site safety coordinator. "Been up there for over an hour, medical emergency or equipment failure." Sarah pushed through the crowd of workers until she could see the situation clearly. The tower crane rose nearly 200 feet into the air, its operator's cab visible as a small structure near the top. The cab was designed to be accessed by a ladder that ran up the inside of the crane's tower, but something had gone wrong with either the operator or the equipment. What happened? Sarah asked Tony, who was standing nearby with a worried expression. Carl went up about an hour ago for routine maintenance, Tony explained, referring to the crane operator. He was supposed to check some hydraulic connections and be back down in 30 minutes. Now he won't respond to radio calls, and the crane won't move. Sarah studied the situation with the analytical mindset that had served her well in combat zones. The tower crane was a critical piece of equipment worth over $1 million, and any serious malfunction could endanger the entire construction site. More immediately concerning was the welfare of Carl Morrison, a veteran crane operator in his late 50s who had worked construction for over 30 years. Has anyone tried to go up? Sarah asked. Mike overheard her question and turned around with obvious frustration. Jake's been trying to find someone qualified to make the climb. It's not like climbing a regular ladder, you need specific training for crane tower rescue. Sarah knew that Jake was facing a serious dilemma. Crane tower rescue required specialized skills that most construction workers didn't possess. The internal ladder system was over 200 feet of vertical climbing with specific safety procedures, and reaching someone who might be unconscious or injured at the top required advanced rescue training. Emergency services are on the way, Jake announced to the gathered crowd, but they're estimating 20 minutes minimum response time. We need to. Jake's words were interrupted by a loud crack from high above. Everyone looked up to see pieces of metal falling from the crane's tower structure. The debris landed in the cordoned-off area below the crane, but the sound indicated that something mechanical was failing. That's not good, Rodriguez muttered, standing next to Sarah. If the tower structure is compromising. He didn't need to finish the sentence. A falling tower crane would devastate the construction site and potentially damage surrounding buildings. The situation was escalating beyond a simple medical emergency. Sarah made her decision quickly. She had the training and experience needed for this type of rescue operation. Her military background included advanced rope work, confined space rescue, and medical emergency response under dangerous conditions. More specifically, she had conducted similar rescue operations in combat zones where equipment failure and casualty evacuation often occurred under hostile fire. Jake, she called out, walking toward the site supervisor. I can go up. Jake turned to look at her with surprise and immediate dismissal. Martinez, this isn't a job for. He paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase his objection diplomatically in front of the entire crew. I have training for this type of rescue, Sarah continued calmly. Rope work, confined space operations, emergency medical response. Where exactly did you get training like that? Jake demanded skeptically. Sarah had hoped to avoid this moment, but Carl Morrison's life might depend on her answer. 12 years military service. Combat engineer. I'd done tower rescues under worse conditions than this. The gathered crowd fell silent. For several seconds, the only sounds came from the construction equipment still operating in distant parts of the site and the occasional radio chatter from Jake's communication system. Jake stared at Sarah with obvious shock. Military? You never mentioned. It didn't seem relevant to construction work, Sarah replied simply. But it's relevant now. Mike stepped forward, his expression showing the same surprise that was evident on most of the workers' faces. What kind of military training are we talking about? 82nd Airborne Division. Combat Engineer Specialist. For combat deployments. Advanced rescue operations, explosive ordnance disposal, emergency medical response. Sarah's voice remained calm and professional as she listed credentials that were completely foreign to the construction environment. I've conducted rescue operations under enemy fire from structures higher and more dangerous than this crane. Jake looked up at the crane tower, then back at Sarah, clearly struggling with his assumptions about her capabilities. The woman he had been dismissing as incompetent was claiming qualifications that exceeded anything anyone else on the site possessed. Can you prove any of this? Jake asked, though his tone had shifted from dismissive to uncertain. Sarah pulled out her wallet and handed Jake her military identification card, which she still carried from habit. Jake studied it carefully, noting her rank, service dates, and military occupational specialty. The credentials were legitimate and impressive. Rodriguez stepped up beside Sarah. "Jake, I worked with her yesterday. Her technical skills are off the charts. If she says she can do this." Another metallic crack echoed from high above, followed by more debris falling to the ground. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and emergency services were still at least 15 minutes away. Jake made his decision. "What do you need?" Sarah was already assessing the equipment available on site. "Climbing harness, rope, medical kit, radio." "Do we have oxygen available?" "Medical trailer has oxygen," Mike volunteered quickly. "I'll get it." "Tony, get a climbing harness from the equipment trailer," Jake ordered, his leadership instincts taking over despite his confusion about Sarah's background. "Rodriguez, grab rope and carabiners." As the crew scattered to gather equipment, Jake pulled Sarah aside for a quick briefing. "What are the risks here?" Sarah studied the crane structure with professional assessment. "Primary risk is that Carl has suffered a medical emergency, heart attack, stroke, heat exhaustion. Secondary risk is equipment failure causing structural collapse. The debris we're seeing suggests hydraulic or mechanical problems that could destabilize the entire tower." "And, you think you can handle both problems?" "I've handled similar situations in Afghanistan and Iraq," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Usually under mortar fire with less equipment and support." Jake stared at her for a moment, trying to reconcile this revelation with his preconceptions about her abilities. The woman standing before him was calmly discussing technical rescue operations with the confidence of someone who had performed them under combat conditions. Within 5 minutes, the crew had assembled the necessary equipment. Sarah quickly checked each piece of gear with the thoroughness of someone whose life had often depended on equipment reliability. The climbing harness was appropriate for industrial rescue work, the rope was rated for more than sufficient weight loads, and the medical kit contained everything she might need for basic emergency response. "I'll maintain radio contact," Sarah told Jake as she secured the medical kit to her harness. "If Carl is conscious, I'll assess his condition and advise on evacuation procedures. If he's unconscious or seriously injured, I may need to stabilize him before attempting to bring him down." "What if the tower structure fails while you're up there?" Jake asked quietly. Sarah paused in her equipment check to look directly at Jake. "Then, you'll have 2 people to rescue instead of 1. But, that structure isn't going to fail in the next hour unless something catastrophic happens." Her calm confidence was infectious. Jake found himself trusting her assessment despite having questioned her competence just minutes earlier. The transformation in his perception was dramatic and disorienting. "Be careful up there," Jake said, and, for the first time since Sarah had joined the crew, his concern for her safety sounded genuine. Sarah began her ascent up the crane's internal ladder system, moving with efficient precision that impressed the watching workers. Her climbing technique was smooth and methodical, each movement calculated to conserve energy and maintain safety margins. She carried the emergency radio clipped to her harness and maintained communication with Jake every 20 feet of elevation. 50 feet up, she reported through the radio. "No obvious structural damage visible so far." Continuing ascent. The climb up the crane tower was physically demanding but, well within Sarah's capabilities. Her years of military training had included far more challenging climbs under much worse conditions. She maintained a steady pace that would allow her to reach the operator's cab without exhausting herself before she could assist Carl. At 100 feet, Sarah paused to assess the crane's mechanical condition from a closer perspective. She could see hydraulic lines that showed signs of stress, and several mounting bolts that appeared to be working loose. The earlier debris had likely come from these failing connection points. "Jake, I can see the source of the mechanical problems," she radioed down. "Hydraulic system is showing signs of pressure loss, and some mounting hardware is failing. The structure is stable for now, but this crane shouldn't be operated until repairs are made." "Copy that," Jake's voice came back through the radio. "How much further to the cab?" "About 70 feet. I should reach Carl in the next few minutes." Sarah continued her climb, noting additional details about the crane's condition as she ascended. Her combat engineering background allowed her to quickly assess the structural integrity and identify the most serious problems. The situation was concerning but not immediately catastrophic. At 170 feet, Sarah reached the level where the operator's cab was accessible via a short lateral ladder. She could see into the cab through its windows and immediately spotted Carl slumped over the control console, apparently unconscious. "Jake, I've reached the operator level," she radioed. "Carl appears to be unconscious but breathing. I'm moving to the cab now." Sarah carefully navigated the lateral access to the operator's cab, using her rope system to maintain safety connections throughout the transfer. The cab was a cramped space filled with hydraulic controls, monitors, and communication equipment. Carl Morrison was indeed unconscious, slumped forward in his operator's seat with his safety harness keeping him from falling. Sarah quickly began her medical assessment, checking Carl's pulse and breathing while looking for obvious signs of injury or medical distress. His pulse was strong but irregular, and his breathing showed signs of respiratory distress. His skin was pale and clammy, suggesting possible cardiovascular problems. "Jake, Carl is alive but appears to be having cardiac issues," Sarah reported through the radio. "I'm going to administer oxygen and prepare him for evacuation." "How far out are the paramedics?" "Emergency services just arrived on site," Jake replied. "Paramedics are gearing up now, but they're estimating another 10 minutes before they can reach your level." Sarah opened the medical kit and began applying emergency cardiac care procedures she had learned during her military medical training. She positioned Carl to optimize his breathing, administered oxygen through a portable mask, and checked his vital signs again. His condition was serious but stable. While monitoring Carl's condition, Sarah also took time to examine the crane's control systems to understand what had caused the mechanical failures. Her engineering background allowed her to quickly identify that a hydraulic pressure failure had triggered multiple system shutdowns, which explained why the crane had stopped operating and why Carl had gone up to investigate. "Jake, I've identified the crane problem," she radioed. "Complete hydraulic pressure loss caused system shutdown. Carl probably came up here when the pressure alarms went off and suffered his cardiac episode while trying to diagnose the problem." "Can you fix it?" Jake asked hopefully. "Not from up here, and not safely with Carl in this condition. This crane needs to be shut down completely until hydraulic repairs can be made." Sarah continued monitoring Carl's condition while waiting for paramedic support to arrive at the cab level. His vital signs remained concerning but stable, and the oxygen seemed to be helping his breathing. She used her radio to provide detailed medical information to the paramedics who were preparing their own ascent. 20 minutes after Sarah had reached the cab, she heard the sound of additional climbing equipment on the ladder below. 2 paramedics, equipped with advanced medical gear and evacuation equipment, were making their own ascent to the operator level. "Martinez, this is Paramedic Johnson," came a voice over the radio. "We're about 30 feet below your position. Can you give us a status update on the patient?" Sarah provided a complete medical briefing on Carl's condition, including vital signs, symptoms, and the care she had already administered. Her military medical training allowed her to communicate with the paramedics using proper medical terminology and procedures. When the paramedics reached the cab, they were surprised to find that Sarah had already implemented appropriate emergency cardiac care and had Carl stabilized for evacuation. Her medical interventions had been textbook perfect and probably crucial for Carl's survival. "Where did you learn medical procedures like this?" Paramedic Johnson asked as he took over Carl's care. "Military training," Sarah replied simply, helping to position advanced medical equipment in the cramped cab space. The evacuation process took another 40 minutes as the paramedics carefully lowered Carl using specialized rescue equipment while Sarah assisted with medical monitoring and safety procedures. Her presence significantly simplified the rescue operation because she was able to provide both medical support and technical assistance throughout the evacuation. When Carl finally reached the ground, he was conscious and alert, his condition stabilized enough for transport to the hospital. The paramedics later told Jake that Sarah's immediate medical intervention had probably prevented Carl's condition from becoming life-threatening. As Sarah completed her own descent from the crane tower, she found the entire construction crew waiting for her at the bottom. The mood was completely different from any previous interaction she had experienced on the site. Instead of skepticism and dismissal, she saw respect and admiration in the faces of her coworkers. Jake approached her as she unclipped from her safety equipment. "Martinez. Sarah. I owe you an apology." "No need," Sarah replied, beginning to organize the rescue equipment for return to storage. "Yes, there is," Jake insisted. "I've been completely wrong about you since day one. You just saved Carl's life and probably prevented a major disaster. Your skills are, well, they're not what I expected." The crowd of workers nodded in agreement. Rodriguez stepped forward with a smile. "I think we all learned something today about making assumptions." Sarah finished organizing the equipment before responding. "I just want to do good work and be part of the team." "You are part of the team," Jake said firmly. "And I think it's time everyone knew exactly who we're working with." Over the next hour, as the site gradually returned to normal operations and the crane was secured for repair, Sarah found herself in dozens of conversations with coworkers who wanted to know more about her background and expressed their gratitude for her actions during the emergency. The transformation in workplace dynamics was immediate and profound. Workers who had previously ignored or dismissed her now sought her opinions on technical issues. Jake began consulting her on complex engineering problems and safety procedures. The respect she had hoped to earn through construction work alone had finally arrived, though through circumstances she had never anticipated. That evening, as Sarah drove home from what had been one of the most eventful days of her civilian career, she reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent months trying to prove herself without relying on her military background, only to have that background become essential for earning the respect she had sought. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Sarah knew that her place on the construction crew was now secure. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her military skills translated effectively to civilian life, even in ways she had never expected. Carl Morrison would make a full recovery and return to work within 6 weeks, his cardiac episode successfully treated with no lasting effects. The crane would be repaired and returned to service with upgraded safety systems. And Sarah Martinez would continue her construction career with the full respect and acceptance of her colleagues, no longer having to prove herself with every task and assignment. The crisis had revealed not only Sarah's capabilities but also the importance of looking beyond surface assumptions to recognize the skills and experience that people bring to their work, regardless of where they acquired those abilities. 3 weeks after the crane rescue, Sarah's life at Morrison Construction had changed completely. Where once she had eaten lunch alone, she now found herself at the center of conversations about complex engineering problems and construction techniques. Jake regularly consulted her on project planning decisions, and the crew had developed a genuine respect for her expertise that went far beyond her military credentials. But, with increased visibility came new challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Corporate executives from Morrison Construction's main office had heard about the crane incident and wanted to meet the veteran employee who had prevented what could have been $1 million disaster and potentially saved a man's life. "Sarah," Jake called out early Thursday morning as she arrived at the construction site, "I need you to clean up and come with me to the main office. The regional vice president wants to meet you." Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach. Throughout her military career, being called to meet with high-ranking officials usually meant either commendation or serious trouble, and she was never sure which until the meeting began. The drive to Morrison Construction's regional headquarters took 30 minutes through downtown traffic. Jake seemed nervous about the meeting, though he tried to mask his anxiety with casual conversation about ongoing projects. Sarah suspected that Jake was also facing questions about why he hadn't recognized her qualifications sooner. Morrison Construction's main office occupied 4 floors of a glass and steel building in the business district. The lobby was decorated with photographs of major construction projects the company had completed over its 40-year history. Sarah studied the images while they waited for their appointment, noting the impressive scale and complexity of the work. "Mr. Morrison will see you now," the receptionist announced, gesturing toward a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. David Morrison, the company's regional vice president and son of the founder, was a well-dressed man in his early 50s who projected the confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions quickly. He stood up from a conference table covered with project plans and financial reports as Sarah and Jake entered the room. "Ms. Martinez," Morrison said, extending his hand for a firm handshake, "I'm very pleased to meet you. Please, have a seat." As they settled around the conference table, Morrison opened a folder that Sarah recognized as a personnel file. Her employee records, work evaluations, and now detailed reports about the crane incident were spread out before him. "I'll be direct," Morrison began. "Your actions 3 weeks ago prevented what could have been a catastrophic accident and potentially saved Carl Morrison's life. Carl is not only a valued employee but also my uncle. My family owes you a debt of gratitude." Sarah nodded politely. "I'm glad I could help. Carl is a good man and a skilled operator." According to the paramedics' report, Morrison continued, consulting his documents, "Your immediate medical intervention was crucial for Carl's survival. They indicated that without your emergency care, his cardiac episode could have become fatal before professional help arrived." Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah with obvious interest. "What I find puzzling is why an employee with your qualifications was working basic construction tasks without anyone recognizing your capabilities. Jake, can you explain this situation?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, Sarah never mentioned her military background during the hiring process or in her first few months on the job. Her application and resume listed construction experience but not military service." Morrison turned to Sarah with a questioning expression. "Is that correct? You didn't include your military service on your employment application?" "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. "I wanted to be evaluated based on my construction skills rather than my military background." "But, your military background includes exactly the kind of advanced technical training we value most highly," Morrison pointed out. "Combat engineering, emergency response, advanced safety procedures, these are premium qualifications in our industry." Sarah had anticipated this conversation but still found it difficult to explain her reasoning. "I was hoping to establish myself in civilian life based on my current abilities rather than relying on past credentials." Morrison exchanged glances with Jake before continuing. "I understand the desire for a fresh start, but, in the construction industry, safety and technical expertise are paramount. Your military experience represents exactly the kind of background we actively recruit for our most challenging projects." Morrison opened another folder and spread out several documents that Sarah recognized as project specifications and proposals. "We have a contract opportunity that requires exactly your qualifications. The Department of Defense is soliciting bids for construction work at military installations overseas. Projects like this require security clearances, military construction experience, and advanced engineering capabilities." Sarah studied the documents with growing interest. The projects were similar to work she had performed during her military service: complex infrastructure development in challenging environments with strict security and safety requirements. The lead engineer position on this contract would mean a significant promotion and salary increase, Morrison continued. It would also mean working with a specialized team on projects that directly support military operations. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "The proposal is due in 6 weeks, and if we win the contract, work would begin within 3 months. The initial assignment would be a 12-month deployment to oversee construction of a forward operating base infrastructure upgrade." Sarah felt conflicted emotions about the opportunity. The work itself was appealing and would utilize her skills fully, but it would also mean returning to a military environment she had been trying to leave behind. "I need some time to consider this," Sarah said diplomatically. Of course, Morrison agreed. "This is a major career decision. But, I want you to know that Morrison Construction values employees with your background and capabilities. Regardless of your decision about this specific opportunity, we want to ensure that your skills are properly utilized in your current position." Morrison turned to Jake with a more serious expression. "Jake, I want you to review Sarah's work assignments and compensation to make sure they reflect her actual qualifications. Her current pay grade and responsibilities don't match her capabilities. Jake nodded quickly. Absolutely, sir. I'll prepare a revised position description and compensation package for your approval. As the meeting concluded, Morrison handed Sarah his business card and detailed information about the overseas contract opportunity. Take whatever time you need to decide, he said. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this are rare, and your qualifications make you an ideal candidate. The drive back to the construction site was quiet as both Sarah and Jake processed the implications of the meeting. Jake seemed relieved that he wasn't facing disciplinary action for his initial misjudgment of Sarah's abilities, but he was clearly uncomfortable about the situation. Sarah, Jake said as they pulled into the construction site parking area, I owe you another apology. I should have taken more time to understand your background and capabilities instead of making assumptions. Water under the bridge, Sarah replied simply. No, it's not, Jake insisted. I've been in this industry for over 20 years, and I should know better than to judge people based on superficial characteristics. You've taught me an important lesson about recognizing talent regardless of where it comes from. Back at the construction site, news of Sarah's meeting with corporate leadership had already spread through the crew. Workers who had witnessed her transformation from dismissed newcomer to respected expert were curious about her future with the company. Rodriguez approached her during the afternoon break with obvious concern. Word is that corporate is trying to recruit you for overseas work, he said quietly. That true? They offered me a position on a military contract, Sarah confirmed. I haven't decided yet. What's holding you back? Rodriguez asked. Sounds like a great opportunity. Sarah considered her response carefully. I left the military to start a civilian career. Taking this job would mean going back to the military environment, even as a contractor. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. My brother faced the same choice when he got out of the army. He ended up taking contractor work in Afghanistan for 2 years. Made good money, but he said it was hard to move forward with civilian life while still working in military environments. What did he do after the contract ended? Used the experience and money to start his own construction company. Now he's building houses for veterans in Texas. Rodriguez paused thoughtfully. Maybe the question isn't whether to take the overseas contract, but how to use whatever opportunity you choose to build the future you really want. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the contract documents Morrison had given her. The overseas position offered an annual salary nearly double what she currently earned, plus hazard pay, housing allowances, and other benefits. The work itself was challenging and important, directly supporting military operations in ways that could save lives and improve conditions for deployed personnel. But, accepting the position would also mean spending at least a year in a military environment, working with military personnel, and dealing with the stress and dangers of overseas deployment, all the things she had been trying to leave behind when she separated from active duty. Sarah called her mentor from the Army, Sergeant Major Patricia Williams, who had helped her plan her transition to civilian life. Williams had served for 28 years before retiring and starting her own consulting business working with defense contractors. Sarah. Williams answered on the second ring. How's civilian life treating you? Sarah explained her situation, describing the crane rescue incident, her changed status at work, and the job offer from Morrison Construction. Williams listened carefully before responding. This is exactly the kind of opportunity one hoped you'd find, Williams said enthusiastically. Defense contracting allows you to use your military skills and experience while building a civilian career. It's the best of both worlds. But it means going back overseas, dealing with military bureaucracy, living in a combat environment again, Sarah pointed out. Temporarily, Williams emphasized. And, as a contractor, not as a soldier. You'll have more autonomy, better pay, and the ability to walk away when the contract ends. Plus, this kind of experience makes you extremely valuable for future civilian projects. Williams paused thoughtfully before continuing. Sarah, you spent 12 years developing skills that very few people possess. Trying to ignore those skills or pretend they don't exist isn't going to make your civilian transition easier. The key is finding ways to use your military background to build the civilian career you want. After the call with Williams, Sarah spent the evening researching Morrison Construction's military contracts and the broader defense contracting industry. She discovered that the company had built a successful specialty division focused on military construction projects, and employees who worked on these contracts often transitioned to leadership positions in the civilian division. The more she learned, the more she realized that the overseas position might be exactly the bridge she needed between her military past and her civilian future. Rather than abandoning her military skills, she could use them to accelerate her civilian career development. Over the weekend, Sarah made her decision. She would accept Morrison Construction's offer, but with specific conditions about her career development and future opportunities within the company. Monday morning, she called David Morrison's office and requested a follow-up meeting to discuss the position in detail. Morrison agreed to meet that afternoon, clearly pleased that Sarah was seriously considering the opportunity. "I'm interested in the overseas contract," Sarah told Morrison when they met in his office, "but I want to discuss how this assignment fits into a longer-term career development plan." Morrison smiled broadly. "I was hoping you'd ask that question. The overseas contract is just the beginning of what we envision for someone with your qualifications." Morrison outlined a career path that would include the overseas assignment, followed by leadership positions on major civilian construction projects, and eventually the possibility of heading Morrison Construction's military contracting division. The progression would allow Sarah to use her military background while building extensive civilian construction management experience. "We're not just hiring you for one contract," Morrison explained. "We're investing in your long-term career development because we believe you can become one of our most valuable leaders." Sarah negotiated specific terms for the overseas assignment, including regular rotation schedules that would allow her to maintain connections with civilian construction projects, professional development opportunities, and guaranteed advancement opportunities when she returned from the deployment. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood before her construction crew for what would be her last day of regular site work before beginning preparation for the overseas assignment. The same men who had questioned her competence just 2 months earlier now listened respectfully as she shared news of her promotion and new responsibilities. "I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to work with you," Sarah said, addressing the gathered crew. "I've learned a lot about construction work, but, more importantly, I've learned about the importance of giving people the chance to show what they can do." Jake stepped forward with obvious emotion. "Sarah, you've taught us all an important lesson about recognizing talent and treating people with respect regardless of our preconceptions. This crew is better because of the example you've set." Rodriguez handed Sarah a gift from the crew, a custom hard hat with her name and the date of the crane rescue. "So you don't forget us when you're building bases overseas," he said with a smile. As Sarah packed her belongings and prepared for the next phase of her career, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point. Her decision to hide her military background had initially made her civilian transition more difficult, but the eventual revelation of her skills had opened doors to opportunities she hadn't imagined. The crane rescue had been a turning point not just in her career, but in her understanding of how to integrate her military experience with her civilian goals. Instead of viewing her past service as something to overcome or hide, she now saw it as a foundation for building the future she wanted. In 3 weeks, Sarah would begin the overseas assignment that would launch her career in military construction management. But she would also maintain her connection to Morrison Construction's civilian projects, positioning herself to eventually lead major infrastructure developments that would serve communities rather than military operations. Her colleagues' transformation from skepticism to respect had taught her that earning recognition often requires patience, competence, and sometimes the willingness to reveal the full extent of one's capabilities when circumstances demand it. The crisis had forced her to choose between maintaining her anonymity and saving a man's life, a choice that had ultimately revealed the path forward for her civilian career. As she drove away from the construction site for the last time as a regular crew member, Sarah felt confident about her future in ways she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Her skills had finally found their proper recognition and application, and her career prospects extended far beyond what she had originally envisioned for her civilian life. 18 months later, Sarah stood in the conference room of Morrison Construction's main office, no longer as a nervous employee meeting with executives, but as the newly appointed Director of Military Construction Projects. The same conference table where she had first discussed the overseas contract opportunity now held architectural plans for 5 different military infrastructure projects spanning 3 continents. The overseas assignment had exceeded all expectations, both for Sarah personally and for Morrison Construction's business development. Her leadership on the Forward Operating Base upgrade project had not only completed the work ahead of schedule and under budget, but had also earned commendations from military officials that opened doors to additional contract opportunities. Sarah, the Pentagon Contract Office called this morning, David Morrison announced as he entered the conference room carrying a folder marked with security classifications. They want to discuss the logistics hub project in Germany. They specifically requested you to lead the proposal team. Sarah reviewed the preliminary project specifications with the expertise she had developed over the past year and a half. The German logistics hub represented a $50 million infrastructure development that would support NATO operations across Europe. Leading the proposal would mean managing a team of engineers, architects, and project managers while coordinating with military officials across multiple countries. Timeline? Sarah asked, already mentally organizing the complex requirements. Proposal due in 8 weeks, project start in 6 months if we win the contract, Morrison replied. But there's something else. The military officials specifically mentioned your reputation from the Afghanistan project. Apparently, word has spread about your capabilities. During her overseas deployment, Sarah had not only managed the construction project but had also implemented innovative safety procedures and efficiency improvements that had become models for other military construction efforts. Her ability to bridge military and civilian construction practices had made her valuable to both sides of the contracting process. The phone in the conference room rang, interrupting their discussion. Morrison answered and handed the phone to Sarah. It's Jake calling from the downtown office building project. Sarah had maintained her connection to Morrison Construction's civilian projects during her overseas assignment, consulting on complex engineering problems and participating in project planning meetings via video conference. Now that she was back in the United States full-time, she split her time between military contracting and high-profile civilian construction projects. Sarah, Jake's voice came through the speakerphone, we're having structural issues with the foundation on the downtown project. The engineers are stumped, and the client is threatening to pull the contract if we can't resolve this by Friday. Sarah was familiar with the downtown office building project, a 30-story high-rise that represented one of Morrison Construction's most prestigious civilian contracts. The foundation work was complicated by underground utility systems and soil conditions that had proven more challenging than initial surveys had indicated. Send me the current structural analysis and soil reports, Sarah instructed. I'll review everything this afternoon and get back to you with recommendations. After hanging up, Morrison looked at Sarah with admiration that had replaced his initial uncertainty about her capabilities. You know, when I first met you, I thought we were just hiring someone with useful military experience. I didn't realize we were gaining a problem solver who could handle both military and civilian engineering challenges. Sarah had indeed become Morrison Construction's go-to expert for complex problem solving, regardless of whether the project was military or civilian. Her unique combination of combat engineering experience, advanced technical training, and practical construction knowledge made her valuable across all of the company's operations. The foundation problem Jake mentioned isn't actually that complicated, Sarah explained to Morrison. It's similar to challenges I dealt with in Afghanistan when we had to build structures over compromised ground while dealing with underground threats. The solutions are different, but the engineering principles are the same. That afternoon, Sarah reviewed the downtown project's engineering reports and quickly identified solutions that had eluded the project's regular engineering team. Her recommendations involved modified foundation techniques she had learned during military construction in unstable environments, adapted for civilian building requirements. By evening, she had prepared detailed technical specifications that would resolve the foundation problems while actually improving the building's structural integrity. The solutions were innovative but practical, drawing on construction techniques from both military and civilian experience. Jake called back the next morning with obvious relief in his voice. Sarah, the engineering team reviewed your recommendations overnight. They're brilliant. Not only do they solve our immediate problems, but they'll actually make the foundation stronger than originally planned. Glad I could help, Sarah replied, already turning her attention back to the German logistics hub proposal. The foundation incident was typical of how Sarah's role at Morrison Construction had evolved. She was no longer just an employee working on individual projects, but had become the company's specialist for complex engineering challenges that required innovative solutions and advanced technical expertise. Her reputation extended beyond Morrison Construction as well. Industry publications had featured articles about her transition from military service to construction leadership, and other companies had attempted to recruit her with increasingly attractive offers. Professional organizations had invited her to speak at conferences about integrating military experience into civilian construction careers. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Carl Morrison, the crane operator whose life Sarah had saved during the emergency rescue, had recovered completely from his cardiac episode and returned to work with a renewed appreciation for both life and safety procedures. Sarah, Carl had told her the week before, "You didn't just save my life that day. You showed everyone on that crew what it means to step up when people need help. That's changed how we all approach our work." The crane incident had become part of Morrison Construction's safety training program, not just as an example of emergency response procedures, but as a demonstration of how recognizing and utilizing all available expertise could prevent accidents and save lives. As Sarah prepared for her trip to Germany to present the logistics hub proposal to Pentagon officials, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that first day when Jake had questioned her ability to handle electrical work without electrocuting herself. The woman who had once eaten lunch alone while enduring constant questions about her competence was now leading international project teams and consulting with military officials on complex infrastructure developments. The skills that had once been hidden behind a desire for civilian anonymity were now the foundation of a career that exceeded anything she had imagined when she left the military. Her assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Sarah, your flight to Germany leaves in 3 hours. The car is ready whenever you are." Sarah gathered the proposal documents and project specifications for the logistics hub contract. The presentation she would give to Pentagon officials the following day represented months of technical analysis and strategic planning. Success would mean not only a major contract for Morrison Construction, but also the opportunity to support military operations that could affect the security of NATO operations across Europe. As she prepared to leave for the airport, Morrison stopped by her office for a final briefing on the German presentation. "Any concerns about the proposal?" "No concerns," Sarah replied confidently. "The technical specifications are solid, our team qualifications exceed the requirements, and our cost projections are competitive. The military officials know our track record from the Afghanistan project." Morrison nodded with satisfaction. "You know, when I first offered you this career path, I thought we were taking a chance on someone with potential. Now I realize that you were taking a chance on us." Sarah appreciated Morrison's recognition, but she also understood that her success had required the support and opportunities that Morrison Construction had provided. "It's been a good partnership," she said diplomatically. "Where do you see your career going from here?" Morrison asked. "We're expanding our international operations, and your military contracting expertise positions you to lead that expansion." Sarah had been thinking about her long-term career goals as her responsibilities and opportunities continued to grow. "I want to keep building bridges between military and civilian construction practices. There's a lot each side can learn from the other." Morrison smiled. "That sounds like the foundation for your own consulting company someday." The possibility of eventually starting her own business had occurred to Sarah, but for now she was focused on continuing to develop her expertise and reputation within the industry. The German contract would be another step in building the credentials she would need for whatever direction her career might take in the future. At the airport, as Sarah waited for her flight to Germany, she received a text message from Rodriguez, her former construction colleague who had become a close friend and occasional professional contact. "Saw the article about you in Construction Weekly. Proud to have worked with you before you became famous. The article Rodriguez referenced was a feature story about veterans successfully transitioning to civilian construction careers, with Sarah highlighted as an example of how military experience could lead to leadership positions in the construction industry. The article had generated several speaking invitations and consulting opportunities that Sarah was still evaluating. During the long flight to Germany, Sarah had time to think about her journey from dismissed newcomer to respected industry leader. The transformation had required not only revealing her military background, but also learning to integrate those skills with civilian construction practices in ways that served both military and civilian clients. The crane rescue had been the catalyst for change, but the real growth had come through consistent performance on challenging projects that gradually built her reputation and expanded her opportunities. Each successful project had led to more complex assignments, and each complex assignment had developed additional expertise that made her valuable for even more challenging work. Landing in Frankfurt, Sarah was met by representatives from Morrison Construction's European operations and escorted to meetings with German construction officials who would be involved in the logistics hub project. The international scope of the project required coordination with both American military officials and German civilian authorities, exactly the kind of complex stakeholder management that had become Sarah's specialty. The presentation to Pentagon officials the following day went exactly as Sarah had anticipated. Her technical expertise, combined with her understanding of both military requirements and construction capabilities, made the proposal compelling and credible. Morrison Construction was awarded the contract within a week of the presentation. Returning to the United States with another major contract success, Sarah found her calendar filling with new opportunities and responsibilities. Morrison Construction was expanding its military contracting division based on her success, and Sarah would be responsible for recruiting and training additional staff to handle the increased workload. But perhaps the most satisfying development was an invitation to speak at a construction industry conference specifically about recognizing and developing talent regardless of background or preconceptions. The conference organizers had heard about her experience of being initially undervalued and wanted her to share lessons about inclusive hiring and talent recognition. 6 months later, Sarah stood at a podium facing an audience of several hundred construction industry executives and managers. Her presentation was titled Hidden Talents, Recognizing Capabilities Beyond First Impressions. 2 years ago, Sarah began her presentation. My site supervisor questioned whether I could handle basic electrical work without electrocuting myself. Last month, that same supervisor recommended me to lead a $50 million international infrastructure project. The audience listened attentively as Sarah described her journey from dismissed newcomer to industry leader, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond surface characteristics to identify actual capabilities and potential. The lesson isn't that military veterans make better construction workers, Sarah continued. The lesson is that talent comes in many forms, and effective leaders create environments where people can demonstrate their actual capabilities rather than just meeting preconceived expectations. After the presentation, several audience members approached Sarah with their own stories about recognizing hidden talents and developing inclusive hiring practices. The conversation continued long after the formal conference session ended, with construction executives sharing examples of how they had learned to identify capabilities that weren't immediately obvious. Jake attended the conference and listened to Sarah's presentation with obvious pride and some lingering embarrassment about his initial misjudgment. During the reception following the presentation, he approached Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Jake said, "listening to you speak today made me realize that the crane rescue wasn't just about saving Carl's life. It was about all of us learning to see people for who they really are rather than who we assume they are." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. The crane rescue forced everyone to look at capabilities rather than assumptions. But the real change came from people being willing to adjust their perceptions based on new evidence. "I changed my hiring and management practices because of what I learned working with you," Jake continued. "Now I spend more time understanding what people can actually do rather than making quick judgments based on superficial factors." As Sarah drove home from the conference, she reflected on how her story had evolved from personal challenge to industry example. The woman who had once hidden her military background to avoid being defined by her past service was now using that experience to help others recognize and develop talent more effectively. Her phone rang as she entered her driveway. David Morrison was calling with news of another contract opportunity, this one involving infrastructure development in Eastern Europe that would require exactly the kind of complex stakeholder management and technical expertise that had become Sarah's specialty. "Sarah," Morrison said, "I know you just got back from Germany, but the State Department is asking specifically for you to lead this project. Your reputation is starting to precede you in international construction circles." Sarah smiled as she parked in her driveway and gathered her conference materials. "Send me the project details," she said. "I'll review them tonight." 2 years after being mocked for her skills and questioned about her basic competence, Sarah Martinez had become one of the most sought-after construction project leaders in the industry. Her 12 years of combat experience had indeed spoken, but not in the way her critics had anticipated. Instead of proving her limitations, her background had revealed capabilities that made her invaluable for the most challenging and important projects in both military and civilian construction. The journey from dismissed newcomer to respected leader had taught Sarah valuable lessons about patience, perseverance, and the importance of letting skills speak louder than assumptions. But, perhaps more importantly, it had shown an entire industry the value of recognizing talent wherever it might be found and however it might be packaged. Her combat history had spoken, and the construction industry had finally learned to listen.